Hundreds of years prior to the inception of the United States of America, colonization and racial dominance were themes that were present from the first established colony in the early 1600s. English colonists assumed the attitude of racial superiority even in the early days of the settlement. By the mid-1600s, slaves from Africa were documented in the Americas and already petitioning for their freedom. Not until the U.S. Civil War in 1863 did slavery become outlawed. Though slavery was officially abolished, segregationist practices would continue into present day. In the early to mid-1900s, segregationist practices were still accepted and legalized. The court case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which a train passenger was not allowed to ride in a more comfortable car because of his race, mandated that facilities could remain separate as long as they were equal. Inherently, separation based on race is never equal. By the mid-1900s, the African American population had strengthened their resolve to organize protests of the unequal treatment they had received for so many years. The civil rights movement began in earnest in the 1950s, with leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Representative John Lewis leading the charge for equality and an end to segregation of all public and governmental facilities and services. Through 2 brutally violent decades and many deaths, the African American community made massive strides towards equality. Unfortunately, we still have much work to do to this very day to ensure that all children grow up to live and contribute to a society where all men are truly created and treated equally. Thurgood Marshall, the nation's first African American to sit on the Supreme Court, was appointed in 1961, a direct result of the cry for equal representation in government. At the end of the original civil rights movement, African American voices in all aspects of our society were more empowered and more present. The period included the rise of black Muslims who were highly vocal about the problems that power and privilege brought to the black community. The Black Panthers, also known as the Black Panther Party, were a political organization comprised of men and women founded in 1966 who began openly challenging police brutality against the African American community. Even now, black males are still overrepresented in a variety of negative demographics compared to their white peers. Black males represent a greater percentage of discipline problems in schools and referral to special education services during their academic careers. A recent California study reported that black males in pre-kindergarten through 3rd grade were 5.5 times more likely to receive suspensions from school than other subgroups, even though they only represent 5% of the total population. They account for 18% of all suspensions. Nationally, black males experience disciplinary consequences at a rate 31% higher than their white counterparts. Unfortunately, these absences from school result in gaps in learning, less efficacy, and a very clear message that they are not wanted or valued. The consequences are that black male adults are less likely to achieve later in life and represent a greater percentage of the incarcerated population in the U.S. The black community has long been subjected to increased instances of profiling, higher rates of use of force, both physically and with weapons, and more harsh sentences than their white peers. The statistics are alarming. The analysis makes clear that black boys and young men are significantly overrepresented in exclusionary discipline practices in California schools, says Luke Wood, a professor of education at San Diego State and co-author of the report. They are unfairly singled out for punishment and receive harsher punishment, placing them at greater risk of dropping out, making them less likely to attend college, and opening the door to pathways into the criminal justice system. California is but a single state. The problems lie not only within a state, but in the perceptive nature and culture of the systems themselves. The problem's larger than a single school or system or even a single state, and the consequences for black males in American society are grave and severe. It's no wonder that black men are hesitant to trust authority. They've rarely been on the receiving end of fair use of it, or at least that is their perception. If you follow the thought lines of Rousseau, their perception is their reality, and the reality of their situation is not pleasant. If you look at how school-to-penitentiary pipeline has started, you can use data to clearly see the pattern. African American students represent roughly 18% of the general population in schools. However, they're more likely to be suspended, multiple times, and more likely to be expelled than their counterparts. Black males are also more likely to be referred to law enforcement and more likely to be arrested than their white counterparts. This early exposure to gaps in their education, early exposure to the criminal justice system, sends a silent but clear message of value or lack thereof, and ultimately the cycle repeats. If you look at behavior broken out by race, Hispanic students are more likely to have alcohol and drugs at school, yet African American students receive a higher level of referral based on proportion to the general population. Even children begin to see themselves as bad or good based on how they're treated and valued, and with so many of these values judgments being proportionately aligned with race, it is no wonder that in adulthood these unconscious biases remain. Children who are raised to think they are bad expect to be bad. This becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for the child. Not only in the southeastern United States, notorious for being the setting of much of the oppression of African Americans and Africans since before the inception of our country, it still overrepresents the number of African American suspensions to this day, reinforcing the systemic nature of this repeating problem. Much better in adulthood. Hispanics only total about 16% of the total population of the U.S., and African Americans only roughly 13% of all Americans. However, the prison population is comprised of 40% African Americans, the highest percentage of inmates, 19% Hispanic, and 39% white. Why wouldn't African Americans in the U.S. feel targeted by a system that is inherently flawed and was never designed to protect them? As a result of the overrepresentation of African Americans in penal and disciplinary settings, society has dubbed this phenomenon a war on blacks in the U.S. In the 1960s, members of the Black Panther Party were specifically targeted by police, many of which died at their hands. In some ways, this declaration of war appears to be true. To this end, the Black Lives Matter movement was created in order to bring awareness to the disproportionate nature of discipline and incarceration rates in our country, as well as over the use of force by persons in authority. Police violence, societal norms, and racial-based hate crimes all contribute to the feelings of unrest and oppression that are resurfacing both in the African American community and within mainstream society. Add to that the high instance of white police officers using deadly force at a disproportionately higher rate with African American males than any other demographic that repeatedly make more nightly news, and you have a snapshot of the level of fear and distrust that exists within minority communities nationwide. In the last 4 years, we've had 10 incidents of officer-involved shootings, one of which was a 12-year-old boy, Tamir Rice, and one was a man fleeing, 17-year-old Laquan McDonald, which earned him 16 shots to the torso. Of these 10 police officers, only 2 have received prison terms, and 1 is still awaiting trial. In addition to the systemic failures of systems of schooling and penal reform, are the realities that organizations designed to breed fear and hate towards various groups of people exist in every state in the Union. Every single state. As the campaign that led to the 2016 national elections began to ramp up, the increase in hate crimes and anti-immigrant sentiment also began to escalate. Politicians cashed in on the fear of the dwindling white male middle class by trying to appear to have common ground. By relating to this population that could feel their grasp on American political dominance slipping, and eventually empowering their messages of fear-fueled hate with Muslim bans, mass deportations, dissolution of the DREAM Act, the building of a wall across our southern border, and most recently, separation of children and families who were caught illegally crossing the border, one segment of the population has become emboldened. Over the past 60 years, white supremacist propaganda was pushed from the mainstream society into the fringes. It never went away, but it did go underground, living quietly in rural areas, in the heartland, and the minds of men within our nation. As a result, when the political process began to reflect their thoughts, their racist and hateful agenda came back into focus. You, the practitioners who are guiding American students abroad, are seeing the ramifications of these dangerous and hateful sentiments, emboldened by a variety of recent events, on your campuses and instructional sites as our students travel abroad.